In the Cascade Mountains of Washington, where winter temperatures plummet to 40 below zero, 16-year-old Kai Chen stares at the wall of white death approaching from the north. The blizzard stretches across the entire horizon, promising to bury everything in its path for weeks. His cabin's heating system failed 3 days ago, and the nearest town lies 50 miles through terrain that will soon become impassable. But Kai isn't panicking. Behind his family's cabin sits a massive granite boulder, 12 feet tall and covered in strange markings his Chinese grandfather carved decades ago. The old man always said the rock held ancient secrets, stories Kai dismissed as folklore. Now, with the storm bearing down and his supplies running dangerously low, those mysterious carvings suddenly seem less like decoration and more like instructions. As the first snowflakes begin to fall, Kai approaches the boulder with new eyes, running his fingers across symbols that seem to pulse with hidden meaning. Could his grandfather have left him more than just stories? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The wind picked up, whistling through the pine trees with an ominous hunger. Kai pulled his wool jacket tighter as he circled the boulder, studying the intricate patterns his grandfather had spent countless hours etching into the granite. The symbols weren't random scratches. They formed deliberate clusters, interconnected lines that seemed to tell a story he'd never bothered to learn. His grandfather, Wei Chen, had died 5 years ago, taking his secrets with him to the grave. The old man had emigrated from rural China in the 1960s, carrying nothing but ancient knowledge passed down through generations of mountain dwellers. He'd chosen this remote location specifically, claiming the land spoke to him in familiar whispers. Kai's parents had always dismissed Wei's stories as the ramblings of an old man clinging to superstition. They'd moved to Seattle when Kai turned 12, leaving him to spend summers alone at the family cabin. The isolation never bothered him. These mountains felt more like home than any city ever could. But now, with his parents unreachable on a business trip in Japan and the storm of the century bearing down, he was truly alone. The temperature had already dropped 10 degrees since morning. His breath formed crystalline clouds that dissolved quickly in the increasingly violent wind. The cabin's wood-burning stove could keep him warm for maybe 3 days, assuming he rationed the remaining firewood carefully. After that, he'd be at the mercy of nature's cruelest season. But something about the boulder called to him now, demanded his attention in a way it never had before. The carvings seemed deeper somehow, more pronounced in the dim afternoon light. Kai traced one symbol with his index finger, a spiraling pattern that reminded him of flowing water. Below it, interconnected triangular shapes pointed downward, converging at a central point near the boulder's base. A memory surfaced unbidden. His grandfather's weathered hands guiding his own across these same markings years ago, the old man's voice barely above a whisper. "The mountain gives life to those who know how to listen, little one. Fire sleeps in the belly of stone. Water flows even when frozen. The ancestors understood. Survival is not about fighting nature, but joining with it." Kai had been 8 then, more interested in his handheld gaming device than ancient wisdom. Now those words carried weight he hadn't appreciated as a child. The snowfall intensified, fat flakes swirling in chaotic patterns around the clearing. Soon visibility would drop to 0, and the boulder would disappear under several feet of snow. This might be his only chance to decode whatever message his grandfather had left behind. He knelt at the base of the granite giant, brushing away pine needles and debris that had accumulated over the years. More symbols emerged from beneath the natural detritus, complex geometric patterns that seemed to indicate specific measurements or directions. One carving, barely visible under decades of weathering, showed what appeared to be a cross-section view of the boulder itself, complete with internal chambers or passages. Kai's pulse quickened. Could there actually be something inside this massive rock? His grandfather had been many things, mysterious, eccentric, occasionally infuriating, but never a liar. Every story the old man told, no matter how fantastical, had contained kernels of truth that revealed themselves over time. Thunder rumbled overhead, an unusual sound for a winter storm. The approaching blizzard was more massive than anything the region had experienced in living memory. Weather reports before his radio died had called it a 1,000-year storm, the kind of event that reshaped landscapes and entered local folklore. Standing back up, Kai surveyed the boulder with new appreciation. Whatever secrets lay hidden within its granite heart, he'd need to unlock them quickly. The storm would arrive within hours, and once it did, he'd be trapped for weeks with dwindling supplies and no way to call for help. His grandfather's voice echoed across the years. The mountain provides, but only for those wise enough to accept its gifts. Time to discover what gifts the old man had left behind. The wind's howl had grown from a whisper to a scream by the time Kyle reached the supply shed behind his cabin. Snow pelted his face like frozen needles, and each step forward required twice the effort it should have. The storm had arrived 3 hours earlier than the weather service predicted, and already the drifts were knee-deep. He yanked open the shed door, fighting against the wind that tried to rip it from his hinges. Inside, his emergency supplies sat neatly organized on metal shelving. Canned goods, batteries, medical kit, propane canisters, everything his grandfather had taught him to keep ready for moments exactly like this. But as Kyle loaded his arms with essentials, a nagging voice in the back of his mind whispered that this storm felt different, bigger, angrier. The trek back to the cabin left him breathless. Visibility had dropped to less than 10 feet, and the familiar landmarks of his property had vanished into a white void. Only the warm glow from his windows guided him home, growing brighter as he stumbled through drifts that now reached his thighs. Inside, Kyle dumped the supplies on his kitchen table and immediately checked his phone. No signal. The landline was dead too, probably a tree down somewhere along the mountain road. He wasn't surprised, but the isolation still sent a chill through him that had nothing to do with the cold. His wood-burning stove crackled cheerfully, filling the small cabin with warmth and the scent of pine smoke. Kyle added another log, then moved to the window that faced north toward the boulder. Even through the driving snow, he could make out its dark silhouette, massive and immutable against the storm's fury. But Henrik had spoken of it differently in his final days. Fevered words about family secrets and old knowledge, about the rock being more than it seemed. Kyle had attributed it to the morphine, the way dying minds sometimes grasped at mysteries that didn't exist. Now, watching the storm rage around that unmoving stone, he wondered if there had been truth in those rambling words. The power flickered once, twice, then died completely. Emergency battery lights kicked on automatically, casting the cabin in a pale blue glow. Kyle checked his watch, only 7 in the evening, but it felt like midnight. The storm's intensity was increasing with each passing hour, and according to his weather radio, it would continue for at least 2 more days. He heated a can of soup on his camping stove and tried to settle in with a book, but concentration proved impossible. The wind's constant assault on the cabin created a symphony of creaks and groans that kept his nerves on edge. Every few minutes, he found himself glancing toward the north window, drawn to check on the boulder's dark presence. Around midnight, something changed. The wind's pattern shifted, and what had been a steady roar became sporadic gusts, punctuated by unsettling quiet. During one of these lulls, Kyle heard something that made his blood freeze, a deep, resonant hum that seemed to come from the earth itself. He pressed his face to the cold window glass, squinting into the darkness. The battery-powered emergency light on his porch illuminated only a small circle of swirling snow. But beyond that circle, something was different about the boulder. It seemed to be emanating, a faint glow barely visible against the storm's white curtain. Kyle rubbed his eyes, certain he was seeing things, but when he looked again, the glow was still there, pulsing gently like a slow heartbeat. The humming sound came again, deeper this time, vibrating through the cabin's floorboards and into his bones. He grabbed his grandfather's journal from the bookshelf, pages yellowed with age and filled with Henrik's careful handwriting. Most entries were mundane, weather observations, maintenance notes, grocery lists. but scattered throughout were cryptic references to the old ways and stone memories and when the White Death comes calling. One passage, written just months before Henrik's death, made Kyle's hands tremble as he read it. The boulder chooses its own time to reveal what lies within. When the mountain tries to claim what is ours, when escape becomes impossible and death walks on frozen feet, only then will the stone remember its purpose. Kyle must know. Kyle must understand. The key is in the blood, in the speaking of the old words. Outside, the humming grew louder, and the glow from the boulder brightened until it was unmistakable. Something ancient was awakening in the storm, and Kyle realized that his survival might depend on secrets his grandfather had taken to the grave. The wind screamed like a living thing as Ethan pressed his back against the ancient boulder, his grandfather's journal clutched against his chest. The leather binding felt warm despite the bitter cold, as if it held some inner heat that defied the storm raging around him. Snow whipped horizontally across the mountainside, turning the world into a white void where visibility dropped to mere inches. He'd been hiking the ridge trail when the weather turned violent without warning. The forecast had called for light snow, nothing more. But mountain weather was notorious for its betrayals, and now he found himself trapped 3 miles from his cabin with temperatures plummeting toward deadly levels. The boulder behind him stood 12 feet tall and nearly as wide, its surface worn smooth by centuries of wind and weather. Strange markings covered its face, symbols that looked almost like writing but belonged to no alphabet he recognized. His grandfather had brought him here countless times as a child, always with that mysterious smile playing at the corners of his weathered mouth. "This rock has stories to tell, boy," the old man would say, running his gnarled fingers across the carved symbols. "Stories that might save your life someday." Ethan had always assumed it was just another of his grandfather's mountain folklore tales, like the stories about spirits in the peaks or the legend of the lost mine. But now, with the storm intensifying and his body heat bleeding away into the merciless cold, those childhood memories took on desperate significance. With numb fingers, he opened the journal to the page he'd bookmarked weeks ago, a page he'd dismissed as the rambling of an old man's imagination. The ink had faded to brown, but the words were still legible in the dim light filtering through the snow. "The sanctuary stone holds the old covenant," his grandfather had written. "When death walks the mountain in white robes, remember the pattern of 3 circles, 2 lines, 1 star. Press where the granite drinks the storm's tears and trust what our blood remembers. 3 circles, 2 lines, 1 star." Ethan squinted at the boulder's surface, searching for anything that matched the description. The carved symbols seemed to shift and blur in the swirling snow, but gradually his eyes began to pick out shapes. There, near shoulder height, 3 circular depressions in the stone, worn so smooth they looked natural. Below them, 2 parallel grooves, and at the center, a 6-pointed star barely visible beneath accumulated ice. His grandfather's words echoed in his memory, "Press where the granite drinks the storm's tears." Ethan looked up at the boulder's surface, watching rivulets of melted snow run down the ancient stone. Most of the water flowed past the symbols, but one stream seemed drawn to the star-shaped marking, pooling in its shallow depression before disappearing into what looked like solid rock. The cold was becoming dangerous now. Ethan could feel his thoughts growing sluggish, his coordination deteriorating. Hypothermia was setting in, and he had maybe an hour before his body began shutting down. He had nothing left to lose. Pulling off his glove, he pressed his bare palm against the star marking. The stone felt strangely warm, and for a moment he thought he imagined it. But no, there was definitely heat radiating from beneath his hand, as if something deep within the boulder was awakening. The symbols began to glow with a faint blue light that pulsed in rhythm with his heartbeat. The sound of the storm seemed to fade, replaced by a low humming that he felt more than heard. The stone beneath his hand grew warmer, and hairline cracks of light spread outward from the star like a spider web. Ethan stared at the impossible opening, his scientific mind struggling to process what he was seeing. This was his grandfather's secret. Not just knowledge of the mountain's dangers, but access to something that defied explanation. The old man's journal held more than folklore. It contained instructions for survival that reached back generations, maybe centuries. The storm's fury intensified, as if nature itself was angry at being cheated of its prey. Ice crystals stung his exposed face like needles, and the temperature continued its deadly descent. He could stay outside and die according to natural law, or step through an opening that challenged everything he thought he knew about reality. The choice was simple. Ethan grabbed his pack and stepped into the glowing tunnel. The moment he crossed the threshold, the stone door ground shut behind him, sealing out the storm's rage and leaving him alone in a place that existed somewhere between the possible and the impossible. The warmth enveloped him like an embrace, and for the first time in hours, he allowed himself to believe he might survive. The wind howled like a banshee outside the cabin walls, rattling the windows with such violence that Kai wondered if the glass might shatter. He pressed his face against the frost-covered pane, squinting through the swirling white chaos that had transformed his familiar mountain landscape into an alien wasteland. The blizzard had been raging for 6 hours now, and there was no sign of it letting up. His grandfather's warning echoed in his mind. When the mountain shows her teeth, boy, you'd better know where to run. But there was nowhere to run now. The storm had descended so quickly that even the old logging roads were already impassable, buried under drifts that reached nearly to the cabin's eaves. Kai turned away from the window and surveyed his meager supplies. 3 cans of beans, half a loaf of bread going stale, and maybe 2 days' worth of firewood if he was careful. The propane for his small heater would last another day at most. He'd come up to the cabin for what was supposed to be a quick weekend trip to clear his head after losing his job at the lumber mill. Now it looked like this remote refuge might become his coffin. The radio crackled with static, occasionally picking up fragments of emergency broadcasts from the valley below. Unprecedented storm system. Roads closed indefinitely. Seek immediate shelter. The words dissolved back into white noise, leaving him more isolated than ever. As darkness fell, the temperature plummeted. Kai could feel the cold seeping through the cabin's thin walls like invisible fingers probing for weaknesses. He fed another precious log to the fire and pulled his grandfather's old wool blanket tighter around his shoulders. The familiar smell of cedar and pipe tobacco that still clung to the fabric brought back memories of countless nights spent listening to the old man's stories. Stories about the mountain, stories about survival, and always, always stories about the boulder. Kai had dismissed most of his grandfather's tales as the ramblings of an old man whose mind was clouded by too many years of solitude. But now, facing his own mortality in this frozen wasteland, he found himself remembering details he'd tried to forget, the way grandfather's eyes would gleam when he spoke of the mountain's secret, the cryptic references to the old ways and what the stone remembers. Most unsettling of all, the insistence that their family was bound to this place by something deeper than mere ownership of the land. "The boulder knows," grandfather had whispered during his final days in the hospital, gripping Kai's hand with surprising strength. "When your time comes, when the mountain tests you, remember what I showed you. The marks aren't just scratches, boy. They're a map." At the time, Kai had nodded politely while secretly wondering if the pain medication was making the old man hallucinate. But now, as the wind screamed overhead and ice began forming on the inside of the windows, those words took on a different weight. The fire was burning low again. Kai reluctantly added another log, calculating how many hours of warmth he had left. At this rate, he'd be burning furniture by tomorrow night. The thought of venturing outside in this storm seemed like suicide, but staying here without fuel for the fire was just a slower form of the same fate. He closed his eyes and tried to picture the boulder his grandfather had been so obsessed with. It sat about 200 yards northeast of the cabin, a massive chunk of granite that had always seemed oddly out of place among the surrounding pine trees. As a child, he'd climbed all over it during summer visits, running his fingers along the strange markings that covered its surface. Grandfather had insisted they weren't natural formations, but Kai had never been able to make sense of the seemingly random lines and symbols. A sudden gust of wind shook the entire cabin, and somewhere in the darkness he heard the sharp crack of a tree falling. The sound sent a chill through him that had nothing to do with the cold. If a tree fell across the cabin, if the roof gave way under the weight of accumulated snow, if the chimney became blocked, he shook his head, trying to dispel the spiraling thoughts of doom. Panic wouldn't help him survive, but as he stared into the dancing flames, he couldn't shake the feeling that his grandfather had been trying to tell him something important, something that went beyond mere family folklore. Outside, the storm continued its relentless assault on the mountain. The temperature gauge by the door read -18 degrees and falling. Kai pulled the blanket tighter and tried to conserve his body heat, but deep down, he knew that conventional survival tactics might not be enough. Tomorrow, if the storm continued, he would have to make a choice: stay in the cabin and slowly freeze to death, or venture out into the killing cold to discover what secrets his grandfather had hidden in that ancient stone. The wind's howl had grown into something almost alive, clawing at the cabin walls with frozen talons. Marcus pressed his face against the frost-covered window, watching snow pile against the glass in twisted patterns. The storm had been raging for 6 hours now, and what had started as heavy snowfall had transformed into a white wall of fury that swallowed the world beyond 20 feet. His grandfather's voice echoed in his memory. "And the mountain shows her teeth. Boy, you'd better be ready to bite back." The radio crackled with static before cutting to silence entirely. Marcus twisted the dial, searching for any signal, any voice that might connect him to the outside world. Nothing. The phone line had died an hour ago, and his cell phone showed no bars, just the mocking glow of no service in the corner. He was alone. The cabin groaned under the weight of accumulating snow, timbers creaking like old bones. Marcus had lived through mountain storms before, but this felt different. The air pressure seemed wrong, pressing against his eardrums with an almost malevolent force. Even the familiar sounds of the forest had been consumed by the blizzard's roar. Outside, the mysterious boulder sat like a dark sentinel in the white chaos, barely visible through the storm. Snow had begun to pile against its weathered surface, but something strange caught Marcus's eye. While snow accumulated everywhere else in deep uniform drifts, around the boulder it seemed to swirl and eddy, as if the stone itself generated some kind of invisible current. "That's impossible," he told himself, but he couldn't look away. He thought about his grandfather's emergency supplies, stored in the root cellar beneath the kitchen floorboards. There were provisions for a week, maybe 2 if he rationed carefully. But what if the storm lasted longer? What if rescue teams couldn't reach him for weeks? The flashlight beam swept across the room, illuminating the old photographs on the mantel. His grandfather's stern face stared back at him from a dozen different angles and decades. In one photo, the old man stood beside the boulder, his hand resting on its surface with what looked like reverence. Marcus had seen that picture 1,000 times, but tonight, something about his grandfather's expression seemed different. There was knowledge in those eyes, a secret held behind weathered features. "And the rock holds more than you know, Marcus. When the time comes, you'll understand." Those had been among his grandfather's last coherent words, spoken during his final days when fever had made him delirious. Marcus had dismissed them as the ramblings of a dying mind, but now they felt heavy with meaning. Another violent gust shook the cabin, and this time Marcus heard something that made his blood freeze. The sound of splitting wood came from the direction of the back wall. He rushed to investigate, finding a section where the logs had separated, creating a gap that let in tendrils of snow and Arctic air. The storm was literally tearing his shelter apart. He grabbed tools and spare lumber from the storage closet, working frantically to patch the breach. His hands grew numb despite his gloves as he hammered boards across the gap, fighting against the wind that seemed determined to rip his repairs away. Each nail felt like a small victory against the mountain's fury. As he worked, his eyes kept drifting to the boulder outside. Even through the storm's chaos, he could swear he saw something, a faint luminescence that pulsed beneath the snow covering its surface. It was probably just his imagination, stress and isolation playing tricks on his vision. But the longer he watched, the more convinced he became that the light was real. "Ancient family secret," he muttered, remembering fragments of his grandfather's stories. The old man had always been cryptic about their family's connection to this land, speaking in riddles about responsibility and guardianship that Marcus had never fully understood. The repair complete, he stepped back to survey his work. It would hold for now, but he could feel the cabin's structural integrity weakening with each passing hour. The storm showed no signs of abating. If anything, it seemed to be gaining strength. Marcus made himself a cup of coffee with the last of his fresh water, conserving the bottled reserves for when the pipes inevitably froze. As he sat by the dying fire, he realized that his grandfather's mysterious words might not have been delirium after all. The old man had survived winters on this mountain for 7 decades. If he said the rock held secrets, maybe it was time to listen. The storm raged on, but Marcus had made his decision. When morning came, if it came, he would venture outside to investigate the boulder. The wind had died to an eerie whisper by the time Marcus reached the boulder, but the silence felt more ominous than comforting. Snow continued falling in thick, lazy flakes that seemed to muffle even his own breathing. The massive stone loomed before him, its surface now completely cleared of snow, revealing intricate patterns carved deep into the granite that he'd never noticed before. His grandfather's words echoed in his mind as he circled the boulder slowly, studying every inch. The carved symbols weren't random scratches from weather or animals. They formed deliberate patterns, spiraling around the rock in concentric circles that seemed to pulse with their own rhythm. At the base, partially buried in accumulated snow, Marcus found what looked like a handprint carved into the stone. Without fully understanding why, he pressed his bare palm against the carved impression. The granite was warm. Marcus jerked his hand back, staring at the rock in disbelief. Nothing around them was warm. The temperature had to be well below 0, and everything else he'd touched had stung with cold. Yet the boulder radiated heat like a banked fire. "What the hell, Grandpa?" he whispered, his breath forming clouds in the frigid air. The wind picked up again, howling through the trees with renewed fury. Marcus felt the storm's intensity returning, and he knew he had minutes at most before conditions became completely impossible. Whatever his grandfather had meant about the boulder providing shelter, he needed to figure it out now. He placed both hands against the warm stone and pushed, testing whether it might roll or shift to reveal a cave beneath. The boulder didn't budge, but the carved symbols began to glow with a faint, pulsing light that seemed to come from within the granite itself. Marcus stumbled backward, his heart hammering. The logical part of his mind screamed that rocks didn't glow, that heat didn't emanate from cold stone, that everything happening violated basic laws of physics. But another part of him, the part that had grown up listening to his grandfather's stories about the old ways and forgotten knowledge, recognized something ancient and powerful awakening. The symbols grew brighter, casting dancing shadows across the snow. The spiral patterns seemed to be moving now, rotating slowly around the boulder's circumference, like some massive combination lock. Marcus approached again, this time noticing that some symbols were brighter than others, forming a sequence that led from the handprint upward toward the boulder's peak. Following his instincts, he traced the glowing path with his finger, starting at the handprint and working his way up. Each symbol he touched flared brighter before settling into a steady golden glow. The warmth spread from the rock into his hands, traveling up his arms and beginning to thaw his frozen core. When he touched the final symbol at the boulder's highest point, the entire rock pulsed once with brilliant light, then began to split. Marcus leaped back as a seam appeared down the boulder's center, widening slowly with a deep, grinding sound that cut through the storm's roar. But the rock wasn't breaking apart, it was opening, the two halves swinging outward like massive doors to reveal a hollow interior lit by the same golden glow emanating from the symbols. The space inside was larger than should have been possible, given the boulder's exterior dimensions, stretching back into shadows that the glowing walls couldn't quite illuminate. The air flowing out was warm and dry, carrying scents of cedar and sage that reminded Marcus powerfully of his grandfather's cabin. He stepped inside, and the two halves of the boulder immediately began closing behind him. For a moment, panic flared. What if he was sealing himself into a tomb? But the warmth enveloping him, the obvious impossibility of what he'd already witnessed, convinced him to trust whatever ancient mechanism his grandfather had known about. The boulder sealed with a soft clicking sound, leaving Marcus in the golden-lit chamber. The storm's fury vanished completely, replaced by absolute silence broken only by his own breathing. The walls curved up and around him, forming a space that felt more like a comfortable room than the inside of a rock. Carved shelves lined the walls, holding objects he couldn't quite make out in the shifting light. As his eyes adjusted, Marcus realized he wasn't alone in the chamber. In the far corner, partially hidden in shadow, sat a figure he recognized despite the impossibility of the situation. His grandfather looked exactly as he had 20 years ago, before age and illness had worn him down. The old man's eyes held the same knowing twinkle Marcus remembered from childhood, and when he spoke, his voice carried the warmth of summer evenings and shared secrets. "You found it," his grandfather said, rising from where he'd been sitting on what appeared to be a stone bench. "I wondered if you'd remember when the time came." Marcus opened his mouth to speak, to ask the 1,000 questions flooding his mind, but his grandfather held up a weathered hand. "There's much to explain, boy, and not as much time as you might think. The storm outside is just the beginning." The wind had died to an eerie whisper by the time Kai pressed his palm against the boulder's surface again. The storm's fury seemed to be gathering strength elsewhere, leaving behind an unsettling calm that made every sound. His breathing, the crunch of snow beneath his boots, the distant crack of ice-laden branches, feel amplified in the thin mountain air. He'd been circling the massive stone for what felt like hours, running his hands along its weathered surface, searching for any clue his grandfather might have left behind. The emergency supplies from his pack were already running low, and the temperature continued its relentless descent. Soon, even his heavy winter gear wouldn't be enough to keep hypothermia at bay. "Come on, old man," he muttered through chattering teeth. "What were you trying to tell me?" The boulder stood nearly 8 feet tall, its dark granite surface scarred by decades of harsh weather. From a distance, it looked like any other ancient stone scattered across these peaks, but up close, Kai began to notice subtle differences. The weathering patterns weren't random. There were sections where the rock appeared almost polished, as if countless hands had touched the same spots over generations. His fingers found a series of small indentations along the boulder's eastern face. At first, he dismissed them as natural erosion, but as he traced their outline, a pattern emerged. They formed a rough spiral, starting near the base and winding upward about 3 feet. Each depression was just large enough to accommodate a fingertip. Kai's heart raced as he remembered something from his childhood. His grandfather had always worn a peculiar ring, a simple band of tarnished silver with a small raised symbol. He'd claimed it was a family heirloom passed down through generations of mountain folk, but he'd never explained its significance. More importantly, Kai still wore that ring. It had been the only thing his grandfather had given him before the old man's death 2 years ago. With trembling fingers, he pulled off his glove and examined the ring. The raised symbol was barely visible after years of wear, but in the fading light he could make out what looked like the same spiral pattern etched into the boulder's surface. The metal felt ice-cold against his skin as he pressed the ring into the first depression at the base of the spiral. It fit perfectly. He heard a soft click, almost inaudible beneath the wind's murmur, and felt the ring settle deeper into the stone as if it had found its intended resting place. Nothing happened. Frustration clawed at his chest as he twisted the ring, pushed it deeper, pulled it back out. Still nothing. The cold was becoming unbearable, and he could feel his rational thinking beginning to cloud. Panic crept in at the edges of his consciousness. the same panic that had killed countless others in these mountains when they let fear override survival instincts. Then he remembered his grandfather's voice during one of their last conversations. "Patience, boy. The mountain doesn't reveal her secrets to those who rush. Follow the path, one step at a time. The path, the spiral." Kai took a deep breath and moved the ring to the second depression, higher up on the boulder's face. Another soft click. Then the third click, the fourth. With each placement, he felt something shifting inside the massive stone, as if ancient mechanisms were slowly awakening after years of dormancy. By the time he reached the final depression near the top of the spiral, his arm ached from stretching upward, and his exposed hand had gone numb with cold. But as the ring settled into place with a final decisive click, the entire boulder shuddered. A grinding sound emerged from deep within the stone, the sound of granite sliding against granite. Kai stumbled backward, his heart hammering against his ribs, as a section of the boulder's face began to swing inward like a massive door. The opening revealed a narrow passage that disappeared into absolute darkness. Warm air rushed out from the hidden entrance, carrying with it the scent of dry earth and something else, something that reminded him of his grandfather's cabin. Old wood, perhaps, or the lingering traces of long-dead fires. Kai retrieved his ring from the final depression and slipped it back onto his finger, his mind reeling with questions. How long had this existed? Who had built it? And more importantly, what would he find inside? The wind began to pick up again, and in the distance, he could see the wall of the returning storm advancing across the valley like a grey tsunami. He had minutes, maybe less, before the blizzard's full fury returned. Without hesitation, he grabbed his pack and squeezed through the narrow opening into the boulder's hidden heart. The moment he crossed the threshold, the stone door began to grind shut behind him, sealing him inside with a finality that was both terrifying and oddly comforting. Darkness enveloped him completely, but the warmth was undeniable. Whatever this place was, it had just become his sanctuary against the storm. The ancient symbols seemed to pulse with their own inner light as Kai traced his finger along the carved grooves. Each mark felt warm against his frozen skin, defying the bitter cold that had claimed so much of his strength. The boulder hummed beneath his touch, a low vibration that seemed to resonate through his bones and into the very core of his being. Behind him, the wind shrieked like a living thing, hurling snow and ice against the rock face with renewed fury. The storm had intensified beyond anything he'd ever witnessed, turning the familiar mountain into an alien landscape of white death. But here, pressed against this mysterious stone his grandfather had shown him only once, Kai felt something impossible: warmth. The symbols began to glow brighter as his trembling fingers found their rhythm, following the patterns his grandfather had made him memorize during those long summer evenings. At the time, Kai had thought it was just another one of the old man's peculiar games, like teaching him to read the wind or predict weather from the behavior of mountain birds. Now he understood it had been preparation for this moment. As the final symbol flared to life under his touch, the boulder began to shift, not the violent grinding of stone against stone, but a smooth, fluid movement that spoke of mechanisms far older than any human settlement on the mountain. A section of the rock face slid inward, revealing a passage that exhaled air warm enough to make steam in the frigid night. Kai hesitated for only a heartbeat before plunging into the opening. The passage sealed itself behind him with the same silent efficiency, cutting off the howl of the storm so completely that the sudden quiet felt like a physical blow. His ears rang in the absence of wind, and for a moment he wondered if he'd lost his hearing to the cold. Emergency flares from his pack cast dancing shadows on walls that seemed too smooth, too perfect to be natural. The passage curved gently downward, leading him deeper into the mountain's heart. With each step, the air grew warmer and carried scents that made no sense: pine sap and wood smoke, growing things and rich earth, as if somewhere ahead lay a forest grove rather than the frozen wasteland he'd left behind. The passage opened into a cavern that defied every law of nature Kai thought he knew. Soft light emanated from crystals embedded in the ceiling, casting everything in a gentle blue-white glow that reminded him of moonlight on fresh snow. But it was what filled the cavern floor that stopped him cold. Gardens, terraced plots of rich dark soil where green things grew in neat rows. Fruit trees heavy with produce lined the walls, their branches reaching toward the impossible light. A stream bubbled up from somewhere in the cavern's depths, winding between the planted areas before disappearing again into the rock. The air was warm and humid, thick with the scent of growing things and completely at odds with the frozen hell raging above. Kai stumbled forward on numb legs, dropping to his knees beside the nearest garden plot. Tomatoes hung ripe and red from sturdy vines, while leafy greens spread in abundance around their base. His stomach cramped painfully at the sight of so much food after days of careful rationing, but even as hunger clawed at him, a deeper wonder held him frozen. This place shouldn't exist, couldn't exist. Not here, not under tons of rock and snow, not without sun or any visible source of heat. Yet the evidence surrounded him, as real as the stone walls and the warm air filling his lungs. Movement caught his eye near the far wall, and Kai's heart lurched. A figure emerged from behind one of the fruit trees, moving with the careful steps of great age. The man was tall and lean, dressed in simple clothes that seemed woven from plant fibers. His hair was white as fresh snow, but his eyes held a clarity that spoke of sharp intelligence and deeper secrets. "You found your way at last," the stranger said, his voice carrying the musical cadence of someone who'd spent long years in solitude. "I wondered if you would remember the patterns before the storm claimed you." Kai struggled to find his voice, his mind reeling with questions and impossibilities. "Who are you? How is this place?" "My name is Thorn," the man said, moving closer with surprising grace for someone who appeared ancient. "And this place exists because your family has kept faith with older agreements, older responsibilities than most remember." His weathered face creased into what might have been a smile. "Your grandfather spoke of you often. He said you had the gift, though you didn't know it yet." The mention of his grandfather sent a pang through Kai's chest. "He never told me about any of this. The boulder, the symbols, this place, none of it." "Some knowledge can only be passed when the need is greatest," Thorn replied, gesturing toward the impossible gardens around them. "The mountain holds many secrets, young keeper, and now the storm above demands you learn them all." The wind had died to an eerie whisper by the time Kai emerged from the boulder's hidden chamber, his mind reeling from what he'd discovered. The ancient symbols carved into the inner walls weren't just decorative, they were a map his grandfather had never mentioned, leading to something called the heart of the mountain in the old language. His hands trembled as he clutched the leather-bound journal he'd found sealed in a metal box. The pages, yellowed with age, contained his great-great-grandfather's meticulous notes about the mountain's secret network of caves and tunnels. According to the entries, their family hadn't just been guardians of one boulder, they'd been keepers of an entire underground sanctuary that could shelter dozens of people through the worst storms. But the journal also contained warnings, dark, urgent scrawls about something that slept deep in the mountain's core, something that the sanctuary's creators had built their refuge to contain rather than protect. Kai's breath formed clouds in the frigid air as he studied the hand-drawn map on the journal's final page. The entrance to the main sanctuary lay 300 yards northeast, hidden behind what appeared to be a natural rockslide. According to his ancestors' notes, the passage would only reveal itself when the mountain's blood, geothermal vents, reached a certain temperature during extreme weather events. The blizzard qualified as extreme. He gathered his remaining supplies, shouldering the pack with numb fingers. The temperature had plummeted even further, and ice crystals formed on his eyebrows within seconds of leaving the boulder's protection. The snow had drifted into towering walls that created a maze of white corridors, each one looking identical to the last. Following the journal's directions, Kai counted his steps carefully. 50 yards northeast, then west around the large pine grove. Except the grove was now buried under 8 feet of snow. He had to navigate by the tops of trees, their highest branches barely visible above the drifts. At 200 yards, something caught his eye, a faint shimmer in the air like heat waves rising from summer pavement. But this was different. The air itself seemed to bend and waver near a particular section of what he'd assumed was solid cliff face. As he approached, warmth touched his face. Not the gentle warmth of shelter, but something deeper, more primal. The rock face here was different too, darker, with an almost oily sheen that seemed to pulse with its own rhythm. Kai pressed his palm against the stone, following the journal's instructions. The surface was warm, almost hot, and he could feel a vibration thrumming through the mountain's bones. He traced the pattern his ancestor had drawn, a complex series of spirals and intersecting lines, and the rock face began to change. At first, he thought his eyes were playing tricks on him. The stone seemed to flow like thick liquid, reshaping itself to reveal a narrow opening just wide enough for a person to squeeze through sideways. Warm air rushed out, carrying scents of earth and something else, something organic and alive. The passage beyond was carved from living rock, its walls smooth and curved like the inside of a massive shell. Bioluminescent moss provided a soft blue-green glow that made navigation possible without his flashlight. The tunnels sloped downward at a gentle angle, and with each step, the temperature rose noticeably. After what felt like hundreds of yards, the passage opened into a vast cavern that took Kai's breath away. The space was enormous, easily the size of an aircraft hangar, with multiple levels carved into the rock walls. Ancient stone dwellings, complete with doorways and window openings, were built into the cavern's sides like a vertical village. But it was the center of the space that made him stop cold. A pool of what looked like liquid silver stretched across the cavern floor, its surface perfectly still and reflective. The same bioluminescent moss grew around its edges, but here it pulsed in slow, rhythmic waves that reminded him uncomfortably of breathing. The journal had called this the heart of the mountain, but standing here now, Kai understood why his grandfather had never told him about this place. This wasn't just a sanctuary, it was something far older and more mysterious than human architecture. As he stepped closer to the pool's edge, he noticed movement beneath its surface, not the random swirling of liquid, but something deliberate, purposeful. Shapes moved in the depths, too large and too organized to be natural phenomena. The journal's final entry echoed in his mind. The mountain sleeps, but it dreams. And in its dreams, it remembers what came before the ice, before the stone, before the silence. We are not the first to seek shelter here, and we will not be the last, but we must never wake what wishes to sleep. The pool's surface began to ripple, and Kai took an involuntary step backward. Whatever lay beneath was responding to his presence, and he had the sudden, terrifying certainty that some secrets were meant to stay buried. The wind had died to an eerie whisper by the time Kai emerged from the boulder's hidden chamber, but the silence felt more ominous than the howling storm. Snow continued falling in thick, heavy flakes that seemed to absorb all sound, creating a muffled world where even his breathing echoed strangely. The ancient symbols still glowed faintly on his skin, pulsing with each heartbeat like a second circulatory system made of light. He'd spent hours inside the boulder, learning to read the carved histories his grandfather had left behind. The revelation still made his head spin. His family weren't just mountain dwellers, they were guardians of something far older than the settlements below. The boulder wasn't a hiding place, it was a beacon, and he'd just activated it for the first time in 3 generations. The implications terrified him almost as much as the storm. Kai pulled his coat tighter and checked his supplies. The jerky and water from the chamber would last another day, maybe 2 if he rationed carefully. But the real question wasn't about food. It was about the responsibility now burning literal marks into his flesh. According to the carvings, the beacon's activation would draw others. Some would come to help, but others would come to claim what his family had protected for centuries. A distant howl cut through the silence, too deep and resonant to be wind. Kai froze, every instinct screaming danger. That sound hadn't come from any animal he knew, and it definitely hadn't come from below the mountain. It had come from above, from the peaks where nothing lived except ice and stone. Unless something had been waiting up there. He scrambled back toward the boulder, but the entrance had sealed itself. His hands found only smooth stone where the opening had been moments before. The symbols on his arms flared brighter, and suddenly he understood there was no going back inside. The beacon had served its purpose, and now he had to face whatever came next. Another howl echoed across the mountainside, closer this time, and answered by two more from different directions. They were coordinating, which meant intelligence, which meant this wasn't about hungry predators driven down by the storm. Kai grabbed his pack and started moving, following a ridge that would keep him above the deeper snow while providing cover among the scattered boulders. His grandfather's journal had mentioned the ice-touched ones in several entries, always with a mixture of reverence and fear, beings that lived in the high peaks, neither fully alive nor dead, bound to the mountain by the same ancient forces that powered the beacon. The symbols on his skin grew warmer as he moved, and he realized they were reacting to something nearby. Not the howling creatures. This felt different, older and more patient. He followed the sensation until it led him to a narrow cave mouth hidden behind a curtain of icicles. Inside, the walls were covered with the same symbols that marked his flesh, but these were carved deep into living rock and filled with what looked like frozen starlight. At the center of the cave sat a figure that made Kai's breath catch in his throat. An old woman, cross-legged on a woven mat, her eyes closed but clearly alive. Her hair was white as fresh snow, and her skin bore the same glowing marks that now covered Kai's arms, though hers pulsed with a steadier, deeper rhythm. She wore clothes from another era, hand-woven wool and leather that should have rotted decades ago, but looked as fresh as if they'd been made yesterday. "You're late," she said without opening her eyes. "I've been waiting since the storm began." Kai's mouth went dry. "Who are you?" "I'm what your grandfather would have become if he'd stayed on the mountain instead of running to the valley." Her eyes opened, revealing irises that swirled with the same light as the carved symbols. "I'm the guardian he should have trained you to replace." The howling outside grew louder, and now Kai could hear the crunch of footsteps in snow. Multiple sets, moving with purpose toward their hiding place. "The ice-touched know you've awakened the beacon," the woman continued, rising gracefully to her feet. "They've been sleeping in the deep cave since the last guardian died, but your activation called them back to purpose. They'll want to test you." "Test me for what?" "To see if you're worthy of the power you've inherited, or if you'll join them in the eternal ice." She moved to the cave entrance and peered through the icicles. 3 of them, maybe 4. Young ones, which is fortunate. The ancient ones would have simply frozen you solid and been done with it. "What am I supposed to do?" She turned back to him with a smile that held no warmth, despite the light dancing across her features. "Survive. The symbols will help, but only if you trust them completely. Fight the instinct to run, and whatever you do, don't let them touch your bare skin." The footsteps stopped just outside the cave. The warmth spreading through his veins felt like liquid fire, but Kai fought against the euphoric pull of whatever substance was now coursing through his bloodstream. His grandfather's journal pages fluttered in his trembling hands as he tried to focus on the cramped handwriting that seemed to dance before his eyes. "The crimson sap must be taken in measured doses," the text warned. "Too little and the body cannot withstand the mountain's fury. Too much and the mind becomes lost to visions that are not of this world." Kai's heart hammered against his ribs as he realized he had no way of knowing how much he'd consumed. The bitter taste still coated his tongue, and already the cave walls seemed to pulse with an otherworldly rhythm. He pressed his back against the boulder, feeling its ancient surface thrumming with energy that matched his racing pulse. Outside, the blizzard's roar had become something else entirely. A voice, perhaps, or maybe a song in a language he couldn't understand but somehow recognized. His enhanced hearing picked up sounds that shouldn't exist, the whisper of snow crystals forming, the groan of ice settling miles away, the distant howl of something that definitely wasn't wind. The journal's pages revealed more secrets as his altered vision seemed to penetrate the faded ink. Diagrams appeared that he'd never noticed before, showing the mountain's internal structure like a vast organism. Chambers and passages snaked through the rock, connecting points that his grandfather had marked with symbols Kai was beginning to understand. "A mountain remembers," one passage read. "It remembers the first people who sought shelter in its bones, who learned to hear its voice and speak its ancient tongue. The crimson sap is its gift to those who prove worthy, but worthiness is not measured in courage alone. It requires sacrifice." Kai's enhanced senses suddenly screamed danger. Something was moving outside the cave, something massive that displaced enough snow to create vibrations he could feel through the stone floor. His modified hearing caught the sound of breathing, deep and rhythmic, like a sleeping giant beginning to wake. He crept toward the cave entrance, journal clutched against his chest. The red sap had sharpened his night vision to an impossible degree, and what he saw in the swirling white darkness made his enhanced blood turn to ice. Tracks, not animal tracks. These were too large, too deliberate. They formed a rough circle around his shelter, as if something had been pacing the perimeter for hours. Each print was easily twice the size of his own boot, with claw marks that gouged deep furrows in the packed snow. The journal's warnings suddenly took on new meaning. His grandfather hadn't just been describing the mountain's geological features. He'd been mapping the territory of something that called this frozen wasteland home. "Sepin, the crimson flows through mortal veins." Another passage revealed itself to his altered perception, and the Guardian takes notice. "It has slept for decades, waiting for the next keeper to emerge. The sap will call to it, and it will come to test the worthiness of the one who dares claim the mountain's power." A low rumble echoed through the storm, too deep and purposeful to be thunder. Kai's enhanced nervous system registered the sound as a challenge, a summons that resonated in his very bones. Whatever was out there knew he was here, knew what he'd become. He flipped frantically through the journal's remaining pages, searching for some clue about how to survive what was coming. His grandfather's final entries grew increasingly erratic, filled with references to the old compact and prices that must be paid. "The Guardian is not evil," one legible passage explained. It is the mountain's immune system, protecting the ancient power from those who would abuse it. To pass its test, one must demonstrate not strength but understanding. The mountain does not belong to us, we belong to it." The rumbling grew closer, accompanied by the sound of massive footsteps that seemed to shake the entire mountainside. Kai's enhanced hearing caught something else, a voice, impossibly deep, speaking words in that same ancient language the wind had been whispering. His altered blood suddenly provided translation, as if the knowledge had always been dormant in his DNA, waiting for the crimson sap to unlock it. The voice was asking questions. "And who claims the old blood? Who seeks to wake what has slumbered? Who will pay the price for power?" Kai stepped toward the cave mouth, journal open to a page showing the ritual his grandfather had never had courage to complete. The crimson sap burning through his system gave him clarity about what was required, what his family line had been preparing for across generations. The test wasn't about surviving the blizzard or even the mysterious guardian approaching through the storm. It was about choosing whether to embrace his heritage fully, accepting both its gifts and its terrible responsibilities. Outside, a shadow darker than the storm-filled night began to take shape, and Kai realized his grandfather's greatest secret wasn't hidden in the boulder at all. It was walking toward him through the snow. The ice cave stretched deeper than Kai had imagined, its crystalline walls gleaming with an otherworldly blue light that seemed to pulse with the rhythm of his heartbeat. The ancient symbols carved into the boulder's surface had unlocked more than just a hidden passage. They had revealed a secret that challenged everything he thought he knew about his family's legacy. His grandfather's journal trembled in his frozen hands as he read the final entries by the ethereal glow emanating from the cave walls. The truth was staggering. The boulder wasn't just a marker or shelter, but a key to an underground network of caves that had sheltered his ancestors for generations during the mountain's most violent storms. More incredible still, these caves were naturally heated by geothermal vents that his great-great-grandfather had discovered over a century ago. But the journal's last entry sent a chill through him that had nothing to do with the cold. The caves demand a price. They give warmth and shelter, but they hunger for something in return. Choose wisely what you feed them, for some who enter these depths are never seen again. Kai pushed deeper into the tunnel, following the strange blue luminescence that seemed to beckon him forward. The temperature rose noticeably with each step, and soon he could remove his outer gloves without his fingers immediately going numb. The sound of dripping water echoed from somewhere ahead, accompanied by something else, a low, rhythmic rumbling that could have been wind, or something far more ominous. The passage opened into a vast chamber that took his breath away. Steam rose from natural pools scattered across the cavern floor, their surfaces mirror-smooth and inviting. Stalactites hung like frozen waterfalls from the ceiling, some glowing with that same mysterious blue light. The air was warm enough that he could finally stop shivering, but something about the space felt wrong, as if he were trespassing in a place meant for something other than human habitation. In the center of the chamber stood another boulder, smaller than the one outside but covered in similar symbols. These carvings were different, though, more complex, more urgent. As Kai approached, he noticed bones scattered around its base. Not human bones, he realized with relief, but the remains of mountain animals, deer, elk, even what looked like a bear skeleton. The journal's warning echoed in his mind as understanding dawned. The caves weren't just heated by geothermal activity. They were part of something larger, something that required sustenance. His ancestors had known this, had made their bargains with whatever force dwelt in these depths. They had survived the mountain's fury by feeding it the creatures that shared their domain. A sound from the tunnel behind him made Kai spin around, his heart hammering against his ribs. Something was moving in the passage, something large enough to scrape against the cave walls as it approached. The blue light began to pulse faster, and the warm air carried a scent he couldn't identify, metallic and organic, like copper mixed with decay. Kai grabbed a burning brand from one of the luminescent formations, surprised to find it cool to the touch despite its light. Whatever energy powered these caves operated by rules he didn't understand. He pressed himself against the central boulder, studying the symbols frantically as the scraping sounds grew closer. One carving caught his attention, a human figure offering something to a serpentine shape that emerged from the mountain itself. Below it, more symbols that he was beginning to recognize from his grandfather's translations: blood given freely, safe passage granted, betray the compact, join the depths forever. The scraping stopped just outside the chamber entrance. In the sudden silence, Kai could hear his own ragged breathing and the gentle bubbling of the thermal pools. Then, slowly, something began to emerge from the tunnel. "You carry the old blood," it said, the words vibrating through Kai's bones. "But you come empty-handed to the sacred chamber. What offering do you bring to ensure your survival?" Kai's mind raced through his limited options. He had no weapons capable of hunting the mountain wildlife, even if he could find any in the middle of the blizzard. His food supplies were nearly exhausted, but as his hand unconsciously moved to the cut on his palm from the boulder's sharp edges, he understood what the creature meant by an offering given freely. "I offer what my ancestors offered," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. "My blood given willingly, in exchange for shelter from the storm." The creature's multiple eyes fixed on him with ancient intelligence. "Blood is a beginning," it replied. "But the storm above is unlike any your ancestors faced. It will rage for days beyond counting. Blood alone will not sustain you through such an ordeal." The implication hung in the air like a death sentence, and Kai realized that his grandfather's final secret might not be salvation at all. The symbols pulsed with an eerie blue light that seemed to emanate from deep within the boulder's core. Kai pressed his palm against the carved surface, feeling warmth spread through the ancient stone despite the howling blizzard that raged around him. The wind had picked up again, driving snow horizontally across the mountainside with such force that he could barely see 3 feet in any direction. His grandfather's journal trembled in his other hand, the pages whipping frantically as he tried to make sense of the cryptic instructions. The old man's handwriting grew increasingly erratic toward the end, as if he'd been writing in desperate haste. Kai squinted at the final entry, dated just 3 days before his grandfather's death. "The chamber opens only when the mountain screams," he read aloud, his words immediately swallowed by the wind. "When the ancient pact is honored with blood and breath." A massive gust slammed into him, nearly knocking him off balance. Ice crystals stung his exposed skin like tiny needles, and he could feel the dangerous numbness creeping up from his toes. His supplies were running dangerously low, and the temperature continued to plummet. Whatever his grandfather had hidden in this boulder, Kai needed to find it now, or he wouldn't live to see another hour. He studied the symbols more carefully, tracing their intricate patterns with his fingertip. They seemed to form a sequence, each one flowing into the next, like a story told in stone. His grandfather had taught him some of the old mountain dialects, but these markings were far older than anything he'd encountered before. They predated the settlements, possibly even predated human habitation of these peaks entirely. The blue light intensified as his finger moved across the final symbol, and suddenly the boulder shuddered, not from the wind, but from some internal mechanism that groaned to life after what might have been centuries of dormancy. Kai stepped back as a hairline crack appeared in the stone's surface, running vertically from top to bottom. The crack widened, revealing not hollow space but a corridor that seemed to burrow directly into the mountain itself. Warm air rushed out, carrying with it the scent of something ancient and earthy. The passage was narrow but tall enough for him to walk upright, and the walls glowed with the same blue phosphorescence as the symbols. Kai grabbed his pack and squeezed through the opening just as another violent gust of wind threatened to tear him from the mountainside. The moment he crossed the threshold, the boulder began to seal itself behind him. He turned to watch the crack close with a grinding finality that made his stomach lurch. There was no going back now. The corridor stretched ahead of him, sloping gently downward into the mountain's heart. The walls were smooth and curved, almost organic in their construction, as if they had been carved by water over countless millennia. But the blue light suggested something else entirely, something that defied natural explanation. As he walked deeper into the passage, Kai began to hear something beneath the muffled roar of the storm outside. It was a rhythmic thrumming, like a massive heartbeat echoing through the stone. The sound grew stronger with each step, accompanied by a subtle vibration in the floor beneath his feet. The corridor opened into a vast chamber that took his breath away. The ceiling soared high above, lost in shadows that the blue light couldn't penetrate. But it was what occupied the center of the chamber that made him stop dead in his tracks. A pool of perfectly still water reflected the phosphorescent glow, creating the illusion that he was standing at the edge of a captured piece of sky. The water was impossibly clear, and as he approached, he could see that it was warm. Steam rose from its surface in delicate wisps. Along the chamber's walls, more symbols were carved into the stone, these ones larger and more elaborate than those on the boulder's exterior. They seemed to tell a story, depicting figures that looked almost human but possessed features that were subtly wrong, too tall, too angular, with eyes that held an alien intelligence. Kai pulled out his grandfather's journal again, flipping to a section he'd previously dismissed as the ramblings of an old man losing his grip on reality. But here, surrounded by impossible architecture and ancient mysteries, those ramblings suddenly made perfect sense. The Watchers came before the ice, he read. They carved the mountain's bones and filled them with their essence. They wait still, sleeping in the deep places, dreaming of the time when the world above grows cold enough for their return. The thrumming grew louder, and Kai realized it wasn't coming from the chamber itself, but from somewhere far below, deeper in the mountain than he could fathom. Something was responding to his presence, awakening after an unimaginably long slumber. He knelt beside the pool, his reflection wavering on its surface. The water called to him with an almost hypnotic pull, promising warmth and answers to questions he'd never thought to ask. The ancient symbols pulsed with an eerie blue light as Kai pressed his palm against the cold stone, feeling the warmth spreading through his frozen fingertips. The boulder had split open like a massive geode, revealing a hollow chamber within that defied everything he thought he knew about the mountain. His grandfather's journal trembled in his other hand, the wind whipping through the cave entrance behind him. "When the mountain calls, the blood must answer," he whispered, reading the final passage aloud. The moment the words left his lips, the chamber filled with a low humming that seemed to emanate from the rock itself. Inside the hollow space, crystalline formations jutted from the walls like frozen lightning, each one glowing with the same ethereal light as the symbols, but it was what lay at the center that made Kai's breath catch in his throat. A sphere of what looked like solidified starlight sat suspended in the air, rotating slowly and casting dancing shadows across the chamber walls. The blizzard raged harder outside, and Kai could hear trees snapping like matchsticks in the wind. The temperature had dropped so severely that his exhaled breath formed ice crystals before hitting the ground. Whatever this ancient secret was, he was running out of time to understand it. He stepped deeper into the chamber, leaving the journal at the threshold. The moment his boot crossed into the hollow space, warmth enveloped him like stepping into a summer day. The sphere pulsed brighter, and suddenly images began flashing in his mind, memories that weren't his own. He saw his grandfather as a young man, standing in this very chamber during another terrible storm. But grandfather wasn't alone. A woman stood beside him, her hand pressed against a different symbol on the wall. Together they were chanting in a language Kai didn't recognize, and the sphere was growing larger, brighter. The vision shifted, and Kai witnessed generations of his family performing the same ritual. Each time, two people were present. Each time they weathered storms that should have killed everything on the mountain. The sphere wasn't just a source of warmth. It was a shield, a barrier that could turn away nature's most violent fury. But as the visions continued, Kai's heart sank. Every ritual required two people, two bloodlines working in harmony. His grandfather had been the last of one line, and Kai was apparently the last of another. The woman in the visions, the one who had stood with his grandfather, she must have been Kai's grandmother, who had died when he was too young to remember. The humming grew louder, more urgent. Through the chamber entrance, Kai could see the storm intensifying beyond anything he'd experienced. The wind was creating a vortex effect in the valley below, and he realized with growing horror that this wasn't just a blizzard. It was the kind of supernatural tempest that occurred perhaps once in a century, the kind that could reshape the entire mountain range. He pressed both hands against the sphere, hoping that somehow he could activate it alone. The crystalline surface was warm to the touch, and he felt energy flowing through it like a heartbeat. But nothing happened. The sphere continued its lazy rotation, beautiful and useless. Panic crept up his spine as he considered his options. He could retreat deeper into the cave system, but without the sphere's protection, he'd likely freeze before the storm passed. He could try to make it back to his cabin, but that meant crossing exposed terrain in winds that were already strong enough to lift him off his feet. Then he remembered the radio in his pack. In all the chaos of discovering the chamber, he'd forgotten about Sarah's weather station team. They'd been caught in the same storm, trapped somewhere else on the mountain, if one of them was connected to the other bloodline. He fumbled for the radio with numb fingers, cursing as it slipped and clattered across the chamber floor. The device had taken a beating during his climb, and when he finally managed to turn it on, only static filled the air. He adjusted frequencies desperately, calling out coordinates and hoping someone would hear. Anyone out there, trapped in the East Ridge caves, need immediate assistance. For long minutes, nothing came back but the howl of wind and crackle of interference. Then, faintly, a woman's voice broke through. This is Sarah Chen. Kai, is that you? We can see some kind of light coming from your position. What is that? Kai's pulse quickened. Sarah, I need you to listen carefully. Do you know anything about your family history on this mountain? Anything about bloodlines or ancient agreements? Static filled the pause before her reply. My great-grandmother used to tell stories about the mountain guardians, said our family had been protecting something up here for generations. Why? Through the chamber entrance, Kai could see lights moving in the distance, headlamps cutting through the storm. Sarah's team was trying to reach him, fighting against winds that could kill them all. Because, Kai said into the radio, watching the sphere pulse with increasing urgency, I think I just found what your family has been protecting. The crystalline chamber pulsed with an otherworldly rhythm, each beat synchronized with Kai's thundering heart. The ancient symbols carved into the walls had begun to glow brighter, casting dancing shadows that seemed to tell stories of generations past. His breath formed silver clouds in the frigid air, but something had changed. The bone-deep cold that had been killing him was retreating, replaced by a strange, tingling warmth that seemed to emanate from the very stone beneath his feet. The voice that had spoken his name still echoed in his mind, unmistakably his grandfather's, yet somehow different, younger, more vibrant. Kai pressed his palm against the central pillar where the voice had seemed to originate, and immediately felt a surge of energy course through his arm. The granite was warm to the touch, impossibly so given the Arctic conditions raging outside. "Grandfather?" he whispered, his voice barely audible in the vast chamber. "I don't understand. What is this place?" The response came not as words, but as images flooding his consciousness. He saw his grandfather as a young man, standing in this very chamber during another devastating blizzard decades ago. He watched as his grandfather placed both hands on the pillar and spoke words in a language Kai had never heard, yet somehow understood. The ancient tongue of the mountain people, a dialect lost to time but preserved in this sacred space. Kai felt his lips moving of their own accord, the forgotten words spilling forth as if he'd known them his entire life. The symbols on the walls blazed brighter with each syllable, and he realized he was activating something that had lain dormant since his grandfather's last visit to this place. The chamber began to transform around him. Sections of the floor slid away with grinding sounds that echoed like distant thunder, revealing hidden alcoves filled with supplies that defied explanation. Dried meat wrapped in oiled cloth, water that remained unfrozen despite the temperature, thick furs that looked as fresh as the day they were prepared. But more incredible still were the tools, implements carved from stone and metal that seemed to hum with the same energy as the chamber itself. A low rumble shook the mountain, and Kai felt the massive boulder above shifting. Panic seized him momentarily, thinking the entrance might seal permanently, trapping him in this mystical tomb. But instead, the grinding sound revealed the opening of additional passages, tunnels that led deeper into the mountain's heart, where the warmth grew stronger. He gathered the supplies with trembling hands, his mind racing as more memories that weren't his own continued to surface. He saw his great-grandfather surviving the legendary blizzard of 1902, watched his great-great-grandmother weather the ice storms that had claimed an entire village. Each generation had added something to the sanctuary, supplies, knowledge, improvements to the chamber that would help their descendants survive future trials. The warmth wasn't magical, Kai realized, but ingeniously practical. The chamber was positioned above a network of geothermal vents that his ancestors had discovered and carefully channeled. The glowing symbols weren't supernatural. They were painted with phosphorescent minerals found deep in the mountain's caves, activated by the heat and moisture of human breath. Every seemingly mystical element had a rational explanation, making the engineering feat even more impressive. But the blizzard still raged outside, and Kai knew his survival depended on more than just finding shelter. The supplies would sustain him, but he needed to understand how to navigate the mountain's hidden passages when the storm finally broke. His grandfather's memories provided fragments, glimpses of secret routes that connected to other concealed shelters scattered throughout the range. As he explored the deeper tunnels, Following the growing warmth, Kai discovered the true scope of his inheritance. The mountain was honeycombed with passages and chambers, an entire hidden world that his family had maintained for generations. Emergency caches, alternative routes, even underground streams that never froze. Everything needed to not just survive in this harsh environment, but to thrive. The storm outside might rage for days more, but Kai no longer felt the crushing weight of desperation. He was exactly where he belonged, in a place prepared by those who had faced the mountain's wrath before him and emerged victorious. The ancient sanctuary embraced him like the arms of his ancestors, and for the first time since the blizzard began, he allowed himself to believe he might actually live to see another sunrise. The mountain had tested him, stripped away everything he thought he knew about himself, and in return had revealed a legacy more incredible than anything his grandfather's stories had ever hinted at. The ancient chamber pulsed with a rhythm that matched Kai's thundering heartbeat. The crystalline formations embedded in the walls had begun to glow brighter, casting dancing shadows that seemed to move with purpose rather than mere physics. He pressed his palm against the smooth stone surface where his grandfather's hand had touched decades before, feeling the warmth that defied everything he knew about this frozen mountain. The temperature gauge on his salvaged equipment read -37 degrees outside. Yet here, in this impossible sanctuary, warmth emanated from the very rock itself. Steam rose from his breath, but not the desperate vapor of a man freezing to death, rather the gentle exhalation of someone finally finding refuge. "What did you really discover up here, grandfather?" Kai whispered to the glowing walls. As if responding to his voice, the crystalline veins pulsed brighter. He followed their path with his eyes, tracing intricate patterns that spiraled toward the chamber's center. There, partially embedded in the floor, lay something that made his breath catch. It wasn't stone or crystal, but metal, ancient and tarnished, yet somehow untouched by corrosion. Kai knelt beside it, brushing away centuries of accumulated dust and debris. The object revealed itself to be circular, about the size of a dinner plate, with markings that resembled no language he'd ever seen. Yet somehow, staring at the symbols, understanding crept into his mind like warmth returning to frostbitten fingers. It was a map, not of the mountain's exterior, but of something far more incredible, a network of chambers and passages that honeycombed the peak's interior. The thermal vents his grandfather had mentioned weren't just random geological phenomena. They were part of an interconnected system that had been modified, enhanced, turned into something approaching technology by hands that had worked this stone long before his family had ever set foot on the mountain. The realization hit him like an avalanche. His grandfather hadn't just stumbled upon a warm cave during that long-ago blizzard. He'd discovered evidence of an ancient civilization that had not merely survived in this harsh environment, but had thrived by learning to work with the mountain's natural forces. Kai's fingers traced the metallic surface, and the moment his skin made contact, the chamber transformed. Light erupted from every crystal formation, revealing details previously hidden in shadow. The walls weren't rough stone, but carefully carved surfaces covered in more of the strange script. Channels had been cut into the rock, directing the flow of heated air through the chamber with mathematical precision. But it was what the enhanced illumination revealed in the far corner that made Kai's heart race with something beyond mere survival hope. Tools, ancient beyond measure, but tools nonetheless. Implements designed for carving stone, for channeling water, for working with the mountain's natural systems. And beside them, preserved by the chamber's unique environment, lay bundles wrapped in material that looked like leather, but felt unlike anything he'd ever touched. With trembling hands, he unwrapped the first bundle. Inside lay what could only be described as a manual, sheets of the same mysterious material covered in diagrams and symbols. The second bundle contained something even more precious, supplies. Concentrated food that looked fresh despite its obvious age, and containers filled with liquid that tasted like the purest mountain spring water. As Kai ate and drank, strength returning to his body, the truth of his situation crystallized. He wasn't just hiding from the storm in some random cave. He'd found the heart of an ancient survival system, one his grandfather had only glimpsed the edges of during his own desperate night decades ago. The thermal network shown on the metal map extended throughout the mountain, connecting dozens of chambers like this one. The storm raging outside, deadly as it was, had driven him to discover what his family had unknowingly guarded for generations. The boulder hadn't been hiding a simple shelter. It had been the entrance to a subterranean civilization's greatest achievement, a mastery of mountain survival that made modern mountaineering equipment look primitive by comparison. But as the immediate rush of discovery faded, darker implications began to surface in Kai's mind. If such an advanced people had once thrived here, what had happened to them? The chambers were preserved but empty, the tools abandoned, the knowledge left behind like a message for future survivors. He looked again at the diagrams in the ancient manual, and his blood chilled as their meaning became clear. They weren't just instructions for survival, they were warnings. The thermal system that kept these chambers warm was powered by something deep within the mountain, something that the ancient inhabitants had learned to harness but never fully control. And according to the symbols, he was beginning to understand with growing dread that something was stirring again. The recent weather patterns, the unprecedented fury of this blizzard, the strange behavior of the local wildlife that had driven him up the mountain in the first place, it was all connected. The mountain was awakening, and Kai had just discovered that his family's secret burden was far greater than simply guarding an entrance to shelter. The ancient mechanism groaned to life beneath Jakob's trembling hands, gears that hadn't moved in decades grinding against accumulated ice and rust. The boulder split wider, revealing a chamber that seemed to exhale warmth into the frigid mountain air. But as he stepped inside, the horrifying truth of his grandfather's legacy became clear. The walls were lined with human skulls. Dozens of them, maybe hundreds, arranged in neat rows like some macabre library. Each skull bore strange markings carved into the bone, symbols that matched the ones on the medallion now burning against his chest. Jakob's breath caught in his throat as he realized these weren't the remains of victims, but of his ancestors. Every generation of his family had ended up here, in this hidden ossuary beneath the mountain. The price of the secret, he whispered, understanding flooding through him like ice water. But there was no time for horror. The warmth emanating from deeper within the chamber called to him, and behind him, the blizzard's fury was reaching a crescendo that threatened to bury the entire mountain face. He pressed forward, past the watching eye sockets of his bloodline, toward a soft amber glow that promised salvation. The inner chamber took his breath away. A natural hot spring bubbled up from deep within the mountain, its surface steaming in the cold air. Ancient carved channels directed the heated water through the rock, creating a sophisticated warming system that had kept this space habitable for centuries. But it was what surrounded the spring that made Jakob's knees nearly buckle. Gold. More gold than he'd ever imagined existed, stacked in neat piles and carved into intricate artifacts. Weapons that gleamed despite their age, tools and implements he couldn't identify. And everywhere, those same mystical symbols, carved into every surface with obsessive precision. His grandfather's journal lay open on a stone pedestal beside the spring, its pages somehow preserved despite the humidity. Jakob's frozen fingers fumbled as he turned to the final entries, reading his grandfather's spidery handwriting by the amber light that seemed to emanate from the very walls. "The mountain chooses," one passage read. "It has chosen our family to guard its secret for 7 generations. The gold is not treasure, it is responsibility. Each keeper must decide, take the wealth and flee, breaking the covenant, or stay and maintain the watch until death claims them. Those who try to leave with the gold never make it past the tree line. The mountain ensures it." Jakob sank to his knees beside the spring, the warmth finally reaching his frozen core. He understood now why his grandfather had been so secretive, why he'd never spoken of the family's true heritage. This wasn't salvation, it was a prison, a beautiful, wealthy prison that had claimed generation after generation of his bloodline. But as he read further, Hope flickered in his chest. There was a third option, one his grandfather had discovered but never had the chance to attempt. The Covenant could be transferred, but only under specific conditions. The mountain would accept a willing substitute, someone who understood the full weight of what they were taking on. Jacob thought of Sarah, trapped somewhere in the blizzard, probably already frozen. He thought of the rescue teams that would never make it through the storm in time. He thought of his grandfather, who had died still bound to this place, never free to live the life he'd dreamed of. The medallion grew warmer against his skin, and suddenly Jacob could feel something else, a presence in the mountain itself, ancient and patient and utterly alien. It had been waiting, watching, testing him since the moment he'd touched the boulder. Every challenge, every near-death experience in the blizzard had been an evaluation. Now it wanted an answer. The warmth of the chamber was already healing his frost-bitten extremities, and the food stores he'd discovered would keep him alive for months. He could survive here until spring, maybe longer, but survival wasn't living, and Jacob realized that his grandfather's greatest gift hadn't been the location of this sanctuary, it had been the choice. Outside, the blizzard's roar began to change pitch, becoming something almost like words. The mountain was speaking, offering its bargain in a language older than human civilization. Accept the responsibility and live in comfort, but never leave. Reject it and face the storm with whatever slim chance remained. Jacob closed his eyes and thought of Sarah's laugh, of the life they'd planned together in the valley below. He thought of children he might never have, of dreams that would die in this golden tomb. When he opened his eyes, his decision was made. He began stripping off his wet outer layers, preparing for what came next. The ancient symbols on the walls seemed to pulse with anticipation, and the presence in the mountain pressed closer, eager to finally seal the covenant that would determine not just Jacob's fate, but the fate of everyone he'd ever loved. The medallion burned against his skin as he reached for his grandfather's journal, ready to write the final entry. The ancient mechanism groaned as Marcus pressed his palm against the final symbol, carved deep into the boulder's heart. The stone responded with a resonance that seemed to echo from the mountain's very bones, and suddenly the chamber filled with a warmth that had nothing to do with fire or shelter. Light bloomed from within the rock itself, not the harsh glare of electricity or the flickering dance of flame, but something older and more primal. The symbols that had guided him through 17 chapters of terror and discovery now pulsed with gentle radiance, revealing the true nature of his grandfather's legacy. The storm outside reached its crescendo, winds howling with such fury that they seemed determined to tear the mountain apart stone by stone. But here, in this hidden sanctuary that existed between the physical and the mystical, Marcus felt the change beginning. The boulder wasn't just a shelter or a repository of ancient knowledge, it was a conduit, a bridge between human will and the raw forces of nature. His grandfather's voice seemed to whisper through the warming air, not the memory of words spoken years ago, but something immediate and present, and Mountain remembers those who understand its true nature. The storm is not your enemy, Marcus. It never was. Understanding flooded through him, like the warmth now radiating from the stone. The blizzard, the isolation, the seemingly impossible survival situation, none of it had been about conquering nature or outlasting its fury. It had been about learning to work with forces beyond human comprehension, to become part of the mountain's ancient rhythm, rather than fighting against it. Marcus placed both hands on the boulder's surface and felt the mountain's heartbeat beneath his palms. The stone grew warmer, and the light intensified, casting dancing shadows on the chamber walls. Through some mechanism he couldn't fully comprehend, but instinctively trusted, he felt his consciousness expanding beyond the confines of flesh and bone. He could sense the storm's pattern now, not as chaos, but as part of a vast, intricate design. The blizzard was already beginning to exhaust itself, its fury spent against the mountain's patient endurance. But more than that, he could feel the safe passages that would open as the winds shifted, the routes that would remain protected even as snow continued to fall. The knowledge flowed into him like inherited memory, not just the immediate path to safety, but deeper wisdom about reading the mountain's moods, understanding the subtle signs that had kept his family's bloodline alive in these treacherous peaks for generations. This was what his grandfather had tried to prepare him for without being able to explain it directly. Some lessons could only be learned through experience, through facing the mountain's ultimate test alone. The boulder's glow began to fade, but the warmth remained, and Marcus knew it would stay with him always. He understood now why the family secret had been passed down through bloodline rather than written instruction. The mountain chose its guardians, and those it accepted became something more than mere survivors. They became part of its eternal story. As the light dimmed to a gentle pulse, Marcus heard the storm's voice changing. The howling fury was softening to a steady whisper, and through the chamber's opening he caught glimpses of stars beginning to pierce the cloud cover. The worst was over, and he could feel the safe path down the mountain calling to him like a familiar song. But he didn't move immediately. Instead, he sat with his back against the boulder, feeling its warmth seep into his bones and chase away the last remnants of cold and fear. He thought about the journey that had brought him here. The initial terror when the storm trapped him, the desperate search for shelter, the gradual discovery of his grandfather's hidden markers, and finally this moment of profound connection with something larger than himself. When he finally stood and gathered his gear, Marcus moved with the confident grace of someone who belonged to these peaks, rather than merely visiting them. The mountain's knowledge was part of him now, and he knew he would never again feel lost or helpless in its embrace. He was the latest guardian in an unbroken chain stretching back through countless generations. The descent began under clearing skies, and with each step, Marcus felt the weight of survival lifting from his shoulders, but it was replaced by something far more significant, the responsibility of keeping the mountain's secrets safe and passing them on when the time came. He understood now that he hadn't just survived nature's deadliest test, he had been transformed by it. As dawn broke over the peaks, painting the snow-covered slopes in shades of gold and rose, Marcus made his way down paths that seemed to welcome his footsteps. The blizzard was ending, but his real journey, as guardian of the mountain's ancient mysteries, was just beginning. Behind him, the boulder settled back into seeming ordinary stone, waiting patiently for the next time it would be needed. The mountain kept its secrets well, and now Marcus was one of them.